There's a lot of reasonable, and to a certain extent, I'd say justifiable fear that the administration is going to call up the National Guard, give orders for that guard to fire on peaceful protesters, and then we're going to be straight into the cool zone, you might say. And I don't want to dismiss those fears out of hand, but I also think that one should not let one's fear overcome one's rational mind. Which means in this case, it's important to actually think very seriously about what the National Guard is, what its training is, and what its approach to civilian protesters has been, and who the personnel are, who the people who are actually in the Guard. And my sense, both from just doing reading on the Guard and kind of American civil authorities, and from my own personal experience with people in both the active duty military and the Guard, is that you're not looking at a bunch of robotic MAGA psychopaths. You're looking at a broad cross-section of the country, and for each state National Guard, a broad cross-section of that state, which tends a bit lower income, which tends to be more non-white than the population at large, and which tends to be pretty young. What this means is that these are people with a broad diversity of backgrounds and ideologies and political views. And when you look at why they tend to enlist, especially in the National Guard, it's very instrumental. This will help pay for college or training or some sort. And their expectation is that they're going to be mostly doing, disaster relief, that kind of thing. And you'll note that when the Guard in the recent years has been deployed to civil unrest, it's mostly been there to basically sort of stand around, make sure nothing gets too out of hand. There aren't really reports from the past 30 years, really, of Guard deployments of antagonistic behavior of National Guard units towards civilians. And that's, I think, what you'd expect given everything. It's also the case that the Guard isn't trained for confrontations with civilians. And in fact, it's actually very difficult to get military troops of any type to use lethal force against civilians. This is even true in outright authoritarian regimes. There's a broad literature on this. It's very difficult to do, and more often than not, when regimes try to do this, it ends up being the beginning of the end for the regime. It's the unusual regime that doesn't see its legitimacy basically torn apart by taking this step. And taking this step is an indication that you don't have power in the traditional sense, power in the sense that people respect your authority and your legitimacy. You're trying to beat people down through brute force, and that even in authoritarian regimes doesn't tend to work that well. Now, I can already hear some of the objections, and one of the biggest objections is going to be, well, what about Kent State? Kent State being in 1970, National Guard, members of the Ohio National Guard fired on students at Kent State University, killing 4. And I actually recommend that you read about Kent State and read about the aftermath of Kent State, because first, I think people citing Kent State aren't actually aware of what really happened in that situation. Kent State wasn't actually a situation where civilian authorities told guardsmen to fire on civilians, nor was the situation when the feds were involved. Kent State involved a bunch of very poorly trained guardsmen sent into a very volatile situation with basically no leadership. And what you get in that kind of situation, right, is people making catastrophic errors, which is what Kent State was. The Guard was mortified by what happened at Kent State, and to a great degree, Guard training since then has been an effort to prevent the Kent State from ever happening again. But the more relevant point for us is that Kent State doesn't constitute an example of guardsmen being ordered to fire on civilians. You have to basically go all the way back to the labor unrest of the 1910s and 20s to find examples of U.S. troops firing on civilians. I think the closest one we have to the present is the Bonus Army March, when American Army units used force against protesting veterans. So almost a century, which is just to say that it's not impossible that you could see force used and that soldiers would just obey. But we don't have very many examples of it ever happening. In the U.S. example, we have a lot of evidence that guardsmen and active duty military are trained specifically about how to avoid those sorts of situations where accidental shootings are happening or unintentional use of force. We have a officer corps and command structure that is very reluctant to engage in any kind of civil pacification orders. It's something they really do not like to do and do not want to do. We have the basic reality that the people who signed up did not sign up to shoot at their friends, neighbors, countrymen. It takes a lot of training to get a soldier to shoot at the enemy. Very difficult to get them to shoot at someone who is not the enemy. What does this mean for what Trump and especially Stephen Miller wants to do? What it means is that their eyes might be a bit bigger than their stomach, that they desperately want to use lethal force against protesters. There's no doubt about that. They want to escalate it to that level. But there's really no guarantee at all that first an order would make its way from the top to the bottom, unchanged, unaltered. Because this would be an illegal order, and everyone involved in passing it along and acting on it might well face criminal charges. And second, there's no guarantee that if this illegal order made its way to the ground, that the people on the ground would obey it. So that's my take. A little longer than I wanted to go, but that's my take. Understand the fear, understand the worry. But at this stage, being able to send that kind of order and know that it will be followed requires first far more civil strife and internal dissolution that we have, and a far more regime consolidation than has been achieved by this administration. Again, more despotic, more authoritarian regimes than this one have tried this and have failed. And so I think the question you have to ask yourself, if you think it's going to happen, if you think it's a virtual guarantee, is what makes this different? What institutional, structural, political, ideological forces make this different such that you can say with reasonable confidence that it's going to happen? Because if you can't identify that, then I think you have to be a little more modest in your predictions.